Hello everyone and welcome back to Mossy Bottom. It's early April and we've just had a massive rainstorm, but the sun is now shining, and here inside my polytunnel it's a whopping 23 degrees, so I actually get to make this video wearing a t-shirt, which is a real treat for me. You may remember the video in which I built this polytunnel. I wanted to share every step of that process for anyone thinking of buying and constructing a tunnel themselves. And since then I've been kind of inspired to create a series of videos showing every stage of the growing process here inside my polytunnel this year, of which this video will be the first. The aim, I suppose, is to encourage and maybe even empower anyone out there who's interested in growing their own food to have a go at it too. And if you already grow food, if you're an experienced gardener, maybe it'll be interesting for you to see a different perspective. For anyone unfamiliar with my life here in Ireland who hasn't seen videos on my channel, I've been growing vegetables outside, just about anything and everything that will grow here in the Irish climate except garlic, for the last 5 years now. And prior to that, I spent a year traveling and volunteering on organic farms and trying to learn everything I could about growing food. So in terms of vegetable growing outdoors, at least here in the Irish climate, I feel pretty confident at this stage. But this is only my second season growing in my own polytunnel. And although last year was fairly successful, the tunnel wasn't built until late May. So this will be my first full season growing undercover. And I am really excited to see what I can make happen in here. So if you stick with me through this series of videos this year, you'll get to see everything from sowing the seeds to hopefully harvesting food. I might even throw in a bit of cooking with homegrown produce later in the year if I feel suitably inspired, although I must admit I don't feel nearly as confident cooking food as I do growing it. I'm not the best cook. So what am I going to show you in this video, apart from one very sleepy dog? I think it must be the heat. Well, firstly, back in February, I built a sand propagator right here in the tunnel, and I filmed it, so I want to share the construction of that with you. Then we're going to plant some seeds. I want to show you the method that I use, the soil medium, the compost, the trays, the watering technique that I have, potting on, all that good stuff. Then I want to talk about some of the mistakes that I've made in the past, and one critical one which I've already made this year. Rather embarrassing, and also show you some of the things that I've developed or started doing to try and solve problems that I've encountered in the past. So in essence, it's all about seed germination and then caring for tender seedlings. Stage one, really, in growing your own food. Now, as I said previously, if you're already an experienced gardener, you'll know a lot of this stuff. You've probably been on this journey yourself. But if that's the case, I'd love to hear some tips from you in the comments, especially relating to growing undercover, because that's something I'm still quite new at. Before we get started though, this video is sponsored by the lovely people at Skillshare, which has loads of content on gardening, as you can see. So if you're hungry for more after watching this, I think it's well worth a look. And as you know, I get to pick out a course which I've enjoyed watching personally. And this time around, rather than mentioning a gardening video, the obvious choice, I went for this. Brine Time, Pickle Like a Pro by Travis Grillo. What a name. I'm not sure if that's his real name, but it's a damn good one if it is. I guess Travis Piccolo would be even better. He's a real character, this guy, but the subject matter is treated with great seriousness, and that is how to take homegrown produce, all types of veggies, and preserve it by pickling, which is a subject I often get asked about, whether or not I do it, and the truth is, I haven't yet ventured into the world of food preservation, canning, pickling. I just haven't got round to doing it. But after watching this course and seeing how easy it is to do, I think it's something I'll give a try this year. Because one thing's for sure, when you grow your own produce, there is always an excess in the autumn, and even my pigs can only eat so much. As always, the first 1,000 people to use the link down in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, and after that, it's only around $10 a month. First of all, propagation. Now that's simply the process of growing plants from seed or from cuttings. And a propagator is generally a heated environment which warms the growing medium, usually compost, allowing you to germinate seeds earlier. And the reason to germinate seeds earlier, you've probably heard gardeners going on about it all the time, is that in countries with cooler summers, like here in Ireland or the UK, you need to give plants a longer growing season in order for them to produce a crop. And this is particularly important for fruit or seed-based vegetables, things like tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, sweet corn, peppers, that sort of thing. So to grow the seeds outside without cover or a propagator, i.e. a heat source, you'd probably have to wait until about May. In fact, I remember doing that as a kid, just putting seeds in pots and putting them outside on the doorstep. And they don't grow until about May, until it really starts to warm up. By which time, of course, it's already too late to get a substantial yield from them before it gets cold again. So a propagator gives you that extra couple of months growing time at the start of each season, and that's critical for getting a good crop later on in the season. And this is my old propagator, which you probably won't remember from my video entitled Growing Vegetables Outside back in 2019. It was the blurry one that no one watched. And this is simply a piece of plywood covered in aeroboard, which is sheet polystyrene used as an insulator, which you can get incidentally from any builder's merchant. It's pretty cheap. And then on top of that, we have an old electric blanket, which I personally used to sleep on. And finally, a layer of waterproof membrane, black stuff. So it's really cheap to build and simple to construct. You can get these single electric blankets now for about 20 euros, something like that. They're not expensive. But I've had great success with this in my mini greenhouse. This year, though, with the Polytunnel, I've stepped things up and introduced a brand new propagator, which is right here behind me. It doesn't look very impressive now because it's covered in plants, but this consists of 25 meters of soil warming cable, running at about 320 watt when it's on, connected to a thermostat, which is just up here. And the thermostat turns the cable on and off based on the temperature that you set. So you can have a very, very specific temperature. Certain things like tomatoes, for instance, like a temperature of about 25 degrees. So you can customize it, you can tweak it exactly as you need it. And I decided to set mine up on one of my existing beds here in the tunnel, just to save me having to construct a table, which would take up the same amount of space anyway. But if you've got a bad back, it might make sense to raise the level of this up. I think that's what most people do. First, I raked the soil level, then I cut some more aeroboard to size, and this stuff's really important because it prevents heat loss down into the ground. It'll definitely save you more in electricity bills than it costs to buy, believe me. You then need to add a piece of membrane as a water barrier, and I had some scrap from the Polytunnel, so I opted to use that, but you can buy this stuff from a builder's merchant as well. As long as it's waterproof, any sort of membrane really should do the job. Then we have the sand, and I already had a quantity of builder's sand for other projects here at Mossy Bottom. About 5 centimeters deep is all you need initially. I then added the cables with a constant gap of about 8 centimeters or 3 inches between them. And I pinned them down using fence post staples, one of my favorite things in the world. It's amazing how many uses fence post staples have. They're the same staples, incidentally, that I use to pin down my strawberry runners. I then covered with another 5 centimeters of sand, leveled with a rake, and then saturated the whole lot with water. And of course, liquid conducts heat better than air, so replacing those air gaps in the sand with water should, in theory, make it more efficient. And that's all there is to it. You don't necessarily need the thermostat. My electric blanket propagator doesn't have one, and that's proven very effective. As long as the compost in your trays is warm, most seeds will start germinating. And this is the thermostat for my propagator. Very easy to adjust the temperature. You just press the arrows here. And I don't know if you can see on the screen because my phone sometimes doesn't show other screens well when recording video, but it shows the temperature here as well. These things will add to the cost of creating a propagator though, probably double it. So if you're on a tight budget, I definitely recommend the electric blanket method, especially if you can get an old one in a charity shop or off someone else's bed they don't need anymore. I certainly couldn't afford to get one of these the first few years I was here. And of course, there is another alternative to using propagators, and that's the tried and tested windowsill technique, which I'm sure most of you have used. It's not really an option for me as I don't have any windowsills living in a caravan, but I'm sure most of you out there do. Fairly common things, aren't they? And one of the advantages, of course, of using a windowsill is that the air temperature in a heated home is enough to heat the soil, the growing medium, without the need for an additional heat source. But there are two big disadvantages which people often don't think about. The first is lack of space. Personally, I'd need to live in a mansion to have enough windowsills to grow this lot every spring. But then I suppose I do grow for self-sufficiency, so a large harvest is essential for me. If you're growing on a smaller scale, that's not such a problem. The second disadvantage, though, is something called etiolation, and that's when seeds grow too quickly because they've got too much heat and not enough light. So they tend to grow very thin and spindly, often more yellow in colour than green due to lack of chlorophyll. And you might think that quick growth is surely a good thing, but when you come to plant that seedling out, even in the tunnel, it will often succumb to the elements because the stalk isn't strong enough and there are just too few leaves, so they'll often collapse over. The perfect place, I think, to germinate seeds is in a conservatory, preferably a south-facing one, but then most of them are south-facing in this part of the world. It's got the light of a greenhouse and the heat of your home, so it combines the best of everything. And I think whenever you see those professional allotment growers on Instagram with their abundant harvests of pumpkin and tomato and cucumber and everything else, when yours are still going to flower, I reckon it's all down to the sneaky use of conservatories early in the year. Or maybe alternatively putting propane heaters in greenhouses. Who in their right mind can afford to heat a completely uninsulated space like this? It's madness, I think. I suppose they must really value those organic veggies, that's all I can say. Behind me you can see a nectarine tree which I planted just a few months ago in the winter. I cut it right back and it's already beginning to flower, which is such a joy to see. There is absolutely no chance that this tree would do well outside here in the Irish climate, but in my polytunnel, if I keep it well pruned, I've got a chance. If I can one day eat nectarines grown from my own tree here in the west of Ireland, wouldn't that be something to boast about? And that brings me nicely onto the subject of planting your seeds. And this is perhaps my absolute favourite job every year. Although it has to be said, I have an awful lot of seeds to plant, so it's become quite a big job here at Mossy Bottom. Thinking about it, actually, it's not the planting part that I love so much, it's the watching them grow. Coming down every morning and checking on their progress, it's just so exciting. Because we're undercover here, and I've got my 2 propagators running, I was able to start sowing seeds in late February. But I like to sow in multiple batches of the same crop so that the harvest is staggered through the season, meaning there's still plenty to sow in April. And this works really well with brassicas, with peas and beans, beetroot, most of the outdoor crops really. So I'm going to plant several trays today and show you just what I do, because one thing I've definitely learned in spending time on other organic farms, and of course in studying horticulture at college, is that everyone has their own way of doing this and believes adamantly that it's the best way, and I'm afraid in that regard I'm no exception. So first of all, the growing medium. And for this, I just use store-bought multi-purpose compost. Having done this for a few years now, I find that the generic garden centre brands are just as good as the named ones and a lot cheaper. One thing I do avoid, though, is compost that contains peat. just because it's such a finite resource and I'm surrounded by peat bogs here. Every year they get depleted and there's less and less there. So I don't really think it's right to use peat for growing my veggies when there are alternatives. The reason I don't use my own compost for germinating seeds is that it's just not fine enough. It tends to have bigger lumps in. And of course you can make it fine, and that's something I'll probably explore at some point in the future. But right now, the masses of compost that I get every year from my compost heaps is dug into the soil for fertility, so all of it's used. In terms of trays, you'll find that professional growers, and I've visited a few in my time at college studying horticulture, really only use this type of modular tray. And they're just the right size for one plant per cell, and the plants are really easy to take out because they have these finger-sized, well, pinky-sized holes in the bottom that you can just push the soil up through. And crucially, because they're so low to the ground, they're not very high at all, the heat from a propagator warms up the soil medium that much quicker than a bigger tray like this one. Saying that, most of my trays are this type, the 24 cell trays, with much bigger modules. I've been using these for years just because they're the only type that my garden centre here in my local town stocks. And they are perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with them, but they tend to fall apart when poking out the seedlings because the plastic's a bit fragile and you can't stick your finger up the bottom. So yeah, these ones are good too, but if I had a choice these days, it would always be to buy this type of tray. So I mix the multi-purpose compost with several handfuls of this stuff. And this is vermiculite. And vermiculite is actually a fireproof insulator. It's mostly used in chimney breasts to prevent fire spreading into the roof. And gardeners among you may well be familiar with the sort of gardening equivalent of this, which is called perlite, and something you can easily buy in garden centres. The big difference is the price. You can buy a huge bag of vermiculite from your local builder's merchant for a fraction of the price of that tiny little bag of perlite that you would get from a garden centre. And the point of vermiculite is that it aerates the soil, preventing compaction. So it's easier for seedlings to access oxygen. And of course, seeds need three things in order to germinate. They need oxygen, they need warmth, and they need moisture. Most don't actually need light, interestingly, at least until they've expended the energy in the seed itself. Just like chicks and ducklings don't need feeding until they've expended the yolk sac from the egg. Once I've filled the tray, I level the surface and then add my seeds. The quantity per cell depends very much on the species that I'm planting. These are beetroot seeds, so we're going with 1 per cell. I don't make any holes with my finger or a pencil. I know a lot of people do that, but I find that just results in the seed being too deep and being more likely to rot. All I do is I pat them down very lightly, and then I cover with a thin layer of sand mixed with a bit more vermiculite. And I use sand at this stage because it's very fine, unlike compost, which can have bits of stick and chunks of organic matter in, which you don't really want obstructing the growth of the seed. Another option, which professionals all seem to recommend, is sieving the compost to create a fine layer on the top of the seeds. And that's great, it definitely works, and I did it in the beginning. The only problem I found with that method is it's very slow, especially when you've got dozens of trays to do. If you're planting as many as me, then using sand is just a lot quicker, and it definitely works. This is my 2nd year doing it, and I've had great results. Make sure it's a fine sand though, you don't want big particles or bits of stone in there. And then I add the tray to this, which is my watering station. And I made it with pieces of aluminium that I salvaged from my old greenhouse that was blown down in the beast from the east a few years ago, and a piece of perspex which I had left over from another project. Essentially it's just a big tray that the water can't leak out of. And most of you have probably heard of bottom-up watering. Well, that's the principle here. Compost is like blotting paper. It absorbs and draws up water from beneath. And there are two big advantages to watering from the bottom rather than the top. Firstly, you're not disturbing the seeds or the surface of the soil. And secondly, the water is going to the roots where it's actually needed. Too much water on the surface can lead to mildews like damping off disease, which is quite common at this stage. Also, you've probably noticed if you water from the top quite frequently, a kind of layer of green scum forming on the soil, and that's definitely not good for your growing seedlings. With this method, you mostly avoid that. So I'll leave this here for a few hours to soak up lots of moisture, and then I'll move it over to my propagator. And at that point, it will have moisture, it will have warmth, and it will have oxygen, particularly having put lots of vermiculite in there to oxygenate and aerate the soil. The only other thing you need is a bit of time. Of course, different seeds germinate at different rates. The beetroot family is fairly quick, so it'd probably only be a couple of days, as are most of the brassicas, spinach, lettuce. But some species, most notably parsnip, and also actually aubergine, peppers as well, are very slow. They can take as long as 2 weeks to emerge. Sometimes you think they're not going to come, and you've almost lost hope, and then suddenly they pop up out of nowhere. So now on to some of my mistakes, as promised. I think Moss has come to console me, haven't you? Because in front of me here is about a dozen dead runner beans. I'll hold one up so you can see. Despite a really good start, they've completely died. And this isn't some terrible disease that's afflicted them. It's simply caused by cold. The bean family in particular are really vulnerable to this. Even a light frost and you'll lose all above ground growth. And polytunnels are absolutely no protection against freezing temperatures. It's a bit of a misconception because we associate things inside with being warmer, but with a single sheet of plastic for walls and a roof with no insulation whatsoever, it just doesn't offer any protection. So what I tend to use is this stuff, and this is agricultural fleece. And on the night in question, it only dropped to -1 in here. I have a thermometer recording the temperatures, but unfortunately, even with that fleece over them, it wasn't enough to protect my beans. The mistake that I made was I moved these pots because I upgraded them. I potted them on into these bigger pots, and then I moved them off my propagator. And I did that because I wanted to create more space on my propagator for new trays. And unfortunately, even with the fleece on top of them, it wasn't enough to save them on that night. So if you start planting things really early, even in a polytunnel, you need to be very careful when it comes to freezing temperatures, because you can lose your entire crop. One thing to say though about these beans is that they will start to reshoot from the roots. You can see this one's already doing it. So you've not lost the entire plant. It will come back, but it will certainly, all above ground growth will die, and it will have to effectively start again. So it's a real setback. Of course, there are some plants that are completely unaffected by freezing temperatures. They have a kind of anti-frost in the leaves and stems that protect them. And this is one such plant. This is a pea, Shiraz pea, and these are ready to go out now. As you can see, they've done really, really well, completely unaffected that night that my beans were killed. And I think it really depends on where the plant derives from. So anything that comes from Europe or North America that's used to spring frosts seems to have mechanisms to cope with freezing temperatures. But plants that come from South America or from tropical regions, they seem to lack that. So you just have to be aware of what can cope with frosts and what can't. Peas, for instance, though, are a great thing to germinate early and then plant out really early, so you get an early June harvest, and that's what I plan to do this year. I couldn't resist stepping outside to cool off and show you my purple sprouting broccoli, which is just doing marvellously well. There's way more than I can possibly eat. It's one of the best things to grow for a spring harvest, and it's so tasty. Cannot recommend purple sprouting broccoli enough. Delicious stuff. So what about watering? Well, every day when I come down here, I check to see which trays need watering, and the easiest way that I find to do that is just to lift them up and feel the weight. A light tray generally is a dry tray. And then I just add them to my watering station, leave them for a few hours, and let them soak up the water before I put them back. So what about getting the water to the tunnel itself? Well, you can't really set up rainwater collection on the polytunnel. It's rather tricky because of the shape of the roof. So what I decided to do was pump water to an IBC tank, which I've got outside my tunnel. As you can see, it's filling up now from my spring. So then inside the polytunnel, I have a little water pump, which you can see here. I think it was about 40 euros this on Amazon, got it online. And you just connect the IBC tank at one end and your hose at the other. It's got an on-off switch, and this is just designed to increase the water pressure in a central heating system in a house. For example, if you want a higher pressure running to your shower or something. They're really easy to get hold of, really easy to install, and the difference that it makes, if you're using gravity alone, then if I turn this on one-handed, you can see with that IBC tank more or less full, the water's just coming out with a trickle. But if I then turn the pump on, it makes a huge difference. And it uses hardly any electricity, they're very low wattage, and it sprayed my camera with water, lovely stuff. But yeah, I'd really recommend setting up something like this if you've got a big tunnel or a greenhouse and it's quite far away from your house, your mains water. Very easy to do. I cannot tell you how much joy I get coming in here every day, spending an hour or two planting, watering, and just generally pottering about, tending to my seedlings and looking after this guy. It's such a pleasure, it really is. And if you haven't sown anything yet this year, it's definitely not too late. At the time of filming this, it's mid-April. You've still got loads of time to get things started. People often ask me if I seed save. Yes, I do. Especially with the bigger seeds, things like sweet corn, beans, peas, things that it's easy to do with. But I do also buy my seeds from online stores. I try to avoid the garden centres and the supermarkets because they're just so overpriced. You can spend 3 or 4 euros on a single little packet that online is maybe 1. So if you're growing food to feed yourself and you need loads of seeds, then I'd thoroughly recommend researching online shops because you'll save a lot of money. In the next video in this series, I'm going to transform this polytunnel from a seed nursery to a green utopia. Sounds ambitious, doesn't it? By planting everything out. I'll talk you through all the species and varieties I'm growing in here and some of the methods I'm going to try and use to encourage a successful crop. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. You might be able to hear a cat purring in the background. They love it in here. It's so warm. They come in here to sunbathe. I've got another exciting video coming later this month. Until then though, enjoy the beautiful spring weather everyone. And if you can, get planting. Bye for now. Been rolling in shit again, haven't you, moss dog? You like that donkey poo? Yes, lovely. I'm being howled at by a cat. God, if it's not the dog, it's the cat. Like Dr. Dolittle. Moss, in you come. Puss, puss, in you come. Moss. Focus, animals, focus. We have a job to do. Yeah. You've got a very bony head. A very bony head. It digs into my ribs, and you don't ever seem to feel anything. Why is that? I'd love to know, Moss. because it's a remarkable quality. I must remember not to eat on camera. This one will have to be for the outtakes. I'll never forget that comment on my last vegetable growing video from someone who was absolutely outraged and disgusted that I should be eating a Brussels sprout in front of others. The perils of making YouTube videos, who'd have thought it? If you want some moss, yeah, you're allowed to eat on camera. You're a dog, so it's okay. Different rules. There's no chance at all that this would grow. Thanks for knocking the camera, Moss. I know you always like to make your contribution. This is Griselda getting very big. Very, very big and fluffy. The cats absolutely love coming in here. I think it's the heat. The problem is they especially like sleeping on the propagator on top of all the seed trays with seeds in them. So you're not strictly speaking allowed in here, are you, Griselda? No. Doesn't stop you though. Sneaky.